Hello and welcome to YouTube. This channel is going to be taking a serpentine approach to documenting a passion project of mine in the field of data sciences and machine learning. I decided to start this channel initially in the interest of posterity, so I plan to catalog the entire research affair starting from the bottom up. I'm going to be covering everything from math and statistics to programming and computer hardware, and a ton of applied machine learning theory obviously is going to factor into that as well, pun intended. I'll even be covering a lot of 3D modeling and philosophical questions to better negotiate the ethereal matters of ethics, both for algorithms we build, but also for considerations concerning code commenting and licensing, and anything else implied by the libraries that we adopt or borrow or use, because I'm going to be using nothing but open source software so that anybody can do this without needing a budget. Anybody with a desktop computer should be able to follow along, or at least even try and practice, or, science is all about peer review, so if anything I do worked once for me but doesn't work for anybody else, please, by all means, let me know. That is the whole point of science after all. So I had this idea for an implementation and optimization solution for artificial general intelligence a few years ago, so I started dabbling here and there just to see if my ideas were viable, and I haven't found any significant roadblocks that would stop me. So, naturally my initial ideas weren't viable, but luckily I came up with better ideas the more I learned, as is often the case with learning anything new. So now I'm quite positive that I've got at least two key ideas that I've yet to see any published research even describing, let alone demonstrating or debunking. So my first thought was to conduct a research project on my own and publish a paper and then get super famous, or just kidding. My first thought was actually that my goal should be to achieve a proof of concept and let someone or a community of someone's either build it themselves or help me with it, because the scope and complexity of creating a single program capable of fixing all of the world's problems universally turns out to be somewhat of a grandiose assignment even for me. So AGI, as it's commonly called, artificial general intelligence, is the holy grail of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the field, broadly speaking. That is ultimately the prime directive, but recognizing the grandiosity of such an enterprise led me to prescribe for myself a secondary target along the way. So the more reasonable and more likely achievable goal is to implement training and execution of neural networks through a graphics engine, since the computations and built-in optimizations for graphics engines have already proven successfully useful in the field of video games, and we've used GPUs and transferred over those same types of matrix multiplication hardware accelerators from within GPUs into machine learning, and that's proved extremely effective as well. So almost all machine learning now is either done on FPGAs or GPUs, and I'll get into the hardware details later. I'll probably give it its own episode actually, because hardware is really important. Understanding how hardware works, not just for the systems that you build and buy, but for the way you write code and how you structure code. Knowing what the code is doing in the hardware itself is sort of prerequisite to optimizing anything. So we now have access to machine learning computers from any old desktop computer with a graphics card, or even just a few processor cores to work with, because now multi-core processors are the norm, which is like a wet dream for a child nerd me. But graphics cards work because they're fundamentally doing the same types of computations, as I mentioned, same types of computations as machine learning, that is. So applying that hardware to a similar function turned out to be pretty elementary migration, thankfully. So this project is going to be a long road, needless to say. But to avoid it feeling completely daunting, I think it's important to make note right from the onset that this project and its offshoots have a not-so-secret tertiary motivation too. I want to make it clear and obvious that science is a practice, a set of methodologies underpinned by logic and discipline. Science is aimed at contributing to a body of knowledge by publishing fresh insights. New developments or new perspectives or angles of attack, whatever you want to call it. It's not to say that peer review isn't really useful. It's actually equally important as cutting-edge research. But I simply don't have access to the hardware required, nor do I have the academic competence to meticulously scrutinize a fully fledged out dissertation on the subject. This project is aimed at finding novel solutions to optimization problems to help advance the field for the people with access to better tools than me, for them to sort of either confirm, reject, correct, develop, work from, whatever. Just to contribute to the field is sort of the main point. Lucky for me, the natural laws do not discriminate against uncredentialed hobbyists such as myself, so science is fully within my reach despite my lack of formalized education. So, although I may not be qualified to practice medicine without a degree no matter how much I learn or study, I am eligible to make strides in discovering new applications for open source tools and free educational programming provided by services like Google's YouTube and TensorFlow projects. Which again, we'll get into all the tools that we're going to be using. There's a list. I think I've got like 40 different pieces now, and it's going to merit its own section for sure. But I'll go through each one, start to finish, and we'll see how things work from the ground up, as I said before, even through all the tools that we're using. So instead of just a tutorial telling you how to use a specific thing by telling you exactly which lines of codes to write, which commands to enter, we're actually going to be understanding things each step of the way so that some other hobbyist other than me maybe can also pick it up without any formalized education on the matter and maybe carry on where I left off or where I went wrong, or hopefully help me along the way, which would be awesome. Science is something that can be done by anyone so long as their application of logic, experimentation, and reason are well-founded and well-defined. Nature doesn't care if a genius or a toddler discovers a proof for a mathematical theorem. If it's true, then it's just true. So I intend to unearth a truth or two, and in the process, to hopefully inspire others to do the same instead of leaving knowledge to only a chosen few who may or may not decide the public has any right to ever see or learn of their discoveries without first paying them a fee or something stupid like that. I believe knowledge ought to be free because that's what's in the best interest of the species, the planet, and everything important in life. Restricting knowledge by way of membership or paywall is unconscionable in my eyes, which motivates me all the more to find a solution to AGI before a government or corporation decide to keep it for themselves, opting for private benefit over the lives of people, as so often they do. To make inroads in any meaningful way without the benefit of formalized education and training, I'm going to have to cross a lot of academic disciplines in the process. From math to programming to software to philosophy to publishing even, like with copyrights and royalty rights and the formatting and stuff. Just for publishing papers, there's specific formatting, and I have to learn all that from the ground up too. So that'll actually all be incorporated in this project. I've been hitting the books pretty hard, not gonna lie, but again, it's been as a hobby over the past a decade or so, but I started learning code on my own a decade prior, so I've got a firm foundation, but not a professionally expert one, for lack of better terms. What else on that? Well, another benefit to me covering this project with the rudimentary stages, from the rudimentary stages to the end, is going to be to help me juggle all the new concepts I'll be forced to wield as I make progress. It's also probably going to be helpful for everyone putting all those know-it-all comments to good use, which will help me for sure, but it might help others with their research project, having me make mistakes and other people explain the corrections and everything. So when I get stuck, I fully expect a lot of discussion and heckling to anybody interested in learning or following this project along with me. I fully encourage participation because that's, again, in everyone's best interest, including the scientific discovery in general. So I hope if you take my research, though, that you also release yours publicly for free. And even better if you make YouTube videos on it so that other people can learn. But Obviously, it takes a lot of work to do these videos, and I don't really expect everyone to do that, but it would be nice if whoever used my research or my progress reports in this devlog or anything like that, if they released it to the public for free. Yeah. What else? I guess if one of those brainiacs decides to take the ideas I lay out and leapfrog ahead of me, that's obviously totally cool, because I'll be inches away from reverse engineering their work to release it into the wild for free anyway, if they do elect to try to own the finished algorithm. But honestly, I like the work, I like the field, I like the intrigue, and I like the fact that it's accessible. And I think most people don't realize how accessible cutting-edge science actually is to a home hobbyist. So having videos might just help others who are getting started in machine learning, obviously. But it might even help other experts too, because I'll have a perspective that they don't have. Because I don't have any doctrine or dogma that might shape my biases or preconceptions. Which would make my efforts just as worthwhile to help them figure something out too. So it's the indirect is just as valuable and important to me as the direct consequence of my work. So sometimes learning just takes hearing an explanation from several different people too, or seeing the same thing in several different ways before it finally clicks, and especially with complex abstractions like we're going to be dealing with, even if you read it perfectly described in a book, hearing it imperfectly described by me might make the perfect description click for them. So learning is a process that's different for everybody, and it's if we had one way of explaining something that just made sense to everybody all the time, then we wouldn't need schools, because people could just learn on their own and they'd just read the one sentence they needed and they'd figure it all out, right from childhood to adulthood. But that's just not how we're built. And that's why I think teachers are so incredibly valuable, is because they learn something deeply enough and they can empathize with their students enough that they can explain the same concept in different ways to different people. And in the end, the whole class comes around to having the same body of knowledge, more or less. Obviously, some know it better than others, but with enough substantial foundation that they can progress along in their academic proceedings. So if you're anything like me and you've dabbled in programming or math or AI already, then you'll probably know there are tons of excellent resources out there, but mostly they all offer an unrealistic perspective of the process of scientific engagements. They have the answers before proposing them, and that's all well and good, because preparation in a video totally makes sense. That's not my forte, but I'm sure that I wouldn't know anything if it weren't for people having well-prepared and well-planned courses that taught me. It just took me longer than most people. But even though the other teachers who prepare properly and lesson plan and who are well-educated do a wonderful job of explaining things, and many of them have wonderful animations and everything too, but sometimes it just takes time chewing on a problem before it sinks in, and the solution finally makes sense only after ruminating and masticating a bit. So I think it may help at least a few people who share my learning issues to not just follow along, but actively go through the steps with me from start to finish to help sort out concepts and ideas for themselves through a slower, more incremental pace that, incremental. It builds on itself. And obviously, I'm gonna try and put in some chapters and things like that. So obviously, you don't have to go through things that you've already got a strong foundation on. You can skip ahead. I'm not gonna stop you. Jump through the screen. But in a nutshell, that's what this channel is for. It's gonna be a churn for sure, but I'll keep things as organized as possible so you can skip around if you've already grasped a concept, so you don't have to watch me struggling through something that you find elementary. Which will happen, I almost guarantee it. So this project is part design, part study, part exercises to practice new concepts after explaining them as I understand them, and the first and most important thing that we're going to have to deal with here is going to be critical thinking, because I believe that the best way to learn to think critically is to practice science under the tutelage of a well-trained science professor. But since we don't have that here on this channel, you're stuck with a public high school graduate with a cheap webcam. So since you're watching this, I presume you've either A, already got that training under your belt, so you're here to simply gain more experience by proxy, or B, you're trying to gain some experience without formal training and likely doing so because you've got your own project goals or hobbies or interests or whatever. I find it extremely meditative actually to write code because it's the concentration of it. And there are actually depression studies that show an effective treatment for depression and anxiety is doing math, believe it or not, because the focus and the way it forces your brain to concentrate in a way that's abstract so that you're not really overwhelmed by stimulus or sensation and feeling. You're mulling things over inside, and working from the inside out is just, it forces your brain to think differently for long enough time that the plasticity can kind of take over and rewire itself a little bit. And maybe it's a logic thing, maybe it's just an attention thing, maybe it's an escapism thing, who knows. But it's just interesting to note that these types of works are actually good for your brain. Not just to like stave off dementia and things like that, but they're great for just generally speaking, helping with memory, emotional disturbance issues, dealing with trauma, even anxieties and things like that. So it's really healthy to get involved in a project like this, but maybe I'll talk about that a bit more a bit later. So at the risk of rambling here, I'll try and get to the point. Critical thinking is what I was getting at. So to be sure we're all on the same page, let's just start by hashing out one of the most important crafts to home. Science implies and applies critical thinking purely and constantly. And critical thinking applies to all facets of life. It's one of the reasons science projects are fantastic hobbies, as I said. Even if it's not explicitly related to your everyday job, or even if you believe you're not particularly good at STEM studies, the practice of reasoning through logic, devising experiments, documenting results, i.e. practicing professional writing, and debugging code is just as valuable as the gadgets and rigs that you wind up building in whatever it is you do in your everyday life. It'll help you care for and raise kids. It'll help you save money fixing the house or problem-solving computer issues, which could cost you money in your job. So it might even help you like relating to your kids if their interests are in technology, or your clients, or getting better grades in a completely unrelated course. Like maths are huge in music theory and art, like drawing and painting and things like that. So even completely unrelated subjects do transmigrate over, or transpose. I don't know what the word for that is. So pretty much anything you can think of and unexpectedly demand a familiarity with critical thinking and the scientific method in some way, shape, or form. So in this episode, I'm just going to run through some of the points of popular misconceptions across a wide variety of subjects, because I think it's really, really important, just socially speaking, that we discuss critical thinking, because there's an evident lack of it broadly. The reason for taking this approach is obviously, well, not obviously, but it is simple in my view. You can't just read a book and be told how to think properly about everything. You need a bunch of examples. And you need a bunch of examples from a bunch of different domains to get a good, clear sense of how to apply a modality of thought to a plethora of circumstantial issues out in the outside world. So this not only provides a clear benefit to solving problems in math and code, as I said before, but also with like accounting and managing a small business, or building a little website for your private enterprise at home shop, or, you know, craft stores or eBay, or whatever you happen to do for work. But it's also things that you've already learned. You can sort of learn to more easily extrapolate those things into other areas of your life too, which you maybe haven't connected those two dots before. So extrapolation and interpolation, by the way, is probably one of the first few episodes I'll be releasing on this channel, so stay tuned for that, but I won't get too much deeper into that. today I just wanted to focus on the reasoning for this project, and I've told you the objectives and goals of the AGI and to repurpose pre-existing optimization algorithms that exist for other in other domains, like for graphics rendering or ray tracing engines is specifically what I'll be using mine for. Oh, the importance of just the process itself, right? We're getting at critical thinking. So I'm being a bit vague so far, so I'm going to get into these examples to get us started. I chose to take note of a few of the less obvious but still impactful situations to help flex the gray matter a little bit and get things interesting, so I hope you'll forgive me if my approach is unconventional. But as I said before, part of the purpose to making these videos too is to teach others who may be having trouble wrapping their heads around ideas like extra-dimensional hyperplanes and polymorphic category theory, intersecting dynamic flows of continuous fields in flux, whatever you want to say, or make things sound complicated. That's not the point. I mean, we'll be getting to that and understanding that, like partial differential equations, which define like thermodynamic heat transfers and fluid flows. We will definitely be getting into that because a lot of that's going to factor into the physics simulations that I also want to repurpose through our render engines. But I'm going to give you the examples so that we can talk about critical thinking, because that's the point of this episode, is to discuss the importance of that type of thought process. This one's going to be a bit longer than my other episodes and probably not as well watched, but doesn't matter to me. It's important enough that I want it documented and on there so that hopefully somebody gains some benefit from it. If nothing else, for posterity, for my motivations if ever questioned. But, okay, well, I'll get right to it. So the first example, let's say you want to level a driveway or a walkway or slope your patio stones away from your house. A level is a bubble of air inside a tube of liquid. Water will show you your slope, and if you take the time to watch the water's behavior under different circumstances too, whether you've got a leveling tool or just a bucket and a hose, you can figure out that water flows downhill, doesn't flow uphill, and stays flat when it's flat. It just spreads itself out. So critical thinking would have you extrapolate the functionality of the leveling tool to the bucket and hose so you could tackle your driveway leveling problem with or without an actual level tool. You could essentially build one with a bucket and a hose. So you can even test these conditions and the idea of dumping water on the driveway to analyze its slope relative to the Earth's gravitational field by producing a little experiment relative to your hypothesis in order to help you analyze the viability of your imaginative solution by closely monitoring the behavior of flowing water on your hand or on the surface area of the water as you tip the bucket. If you look in the bucket and just look at the surface area, you can rationally migrate your observations from the abstract understanding gathered by critical analysis and creatively come up with solutions or tools that'll help you. So with the top-down view from the physical world, it's possible to transfer knowledge from one domain to another one, which is materially affecting you now, namely your landscaping project. But which isn't necessarily specific to the problem itself. You're taking one body of information and using it to construct another view of another body of information, or a tool that'll help you construct another view of another body of information. So this type of real-world experience watching water move around on a different surface is going to help catch errors when data analytics are visualized, because fluid dynamics are very similar to the math applied to machine learning algorithms, believe it or not. Then you can kind of apply that calculating heat transfers through solid objects, as I said before, or estimating shear forces on a tent if you set it up on a hillside and if the wind changes directions, or building that super stable paper airplane that makes your kids believe you're a Nobel laureate. Well, for at least a few minutes, before a cartoon bear grabs their attention and you're back to making lunches. But totally worth the few minutes, by the way. It'll help you catch errors in your finances, having an intuition about interrelated dynamics and derivatives like we'll be covering in these videos, which is also part of fluid flows from the last example, and also integral, again, no pun intended, to machine learning and theory. So rather than just learning the math formula directly and applying them to cookie-cutter problems curated for us by guidebooks and teachers and textbooks or whatever, learning things slowly and deeply means that you're going to remember it forever without trying because it just makes sense to you. And then you can apply it anywhere else that becomes a viable practical solution to a problem and you wouldn't otherwise have even considered it would be helpful, and you wouldn't have the skills or tools to be able to apply it anyway. Even if you did come up with the idea that it would help you. So you'll be able to dissect like spreadsheets for errors and tweak scripts to correct the issues of automation in your business or workplace, and even make the ones that you have that work more useful or effective or quicker to run, so you're not wasting as much resources doing the same amount of work. So when calculating the curl of a vector field, for example, across topological structures, the flow of a vector field from or within a given manifold to some random function space, you have a baseline understanding of a common fluid flow, as we'll need to implement some forms of AGI algorithms because the boundary conditions exist in the form of the vessel, container, whatever you want to call it, that's holding that body of water that's sloshing around inside. And each molecule of water, or whatever fluid is in there, it could be air, gases or fluids too, they interact based on their neighboring particle or molecule or whatever. If we're talking about quantum physics or something, then it would be particles, and quantum mechanics would suggest like subatomic particles, but their dynamics are completely different. They work in wave functions, which we'll also be using, so even though it sounds unreal, probabilistic wave functions, collapsing is also pretty much the same thing as like cellular automata that relate or change state depending on their neighbor's state, and their neighbors change state depending on their neighbor's state, etc., etc. So where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so even just talking about vector fields and fluid flows from within manifolds or topological structures, as we'll be doing with our AI algorithms, we can actually more easily pick up concepts like interacting with vector fields in higher dimensional spaces, because the critical mind, after being practiced with the fundamentals and then knowing the math, will be able to recognize patterns in that abstraction as akin to oil and water mixed together and applied to a pan, like, or a pan that's lined with an aluminum foil or something. So it'll have this shape, but it'll have some ridges and bumps, and then it'll have this fluid, and that fluid will be like hydrophilic or hydrophobic, whichever your experiment dictates. It either attracts water or repels water. So you could have fluid flows within fluid flows on a manifold, or in a manifold on top of a topological structure that's confined to that manifold. So like all of these types of complexities can then be integrated together, one on top of the other. And you can more easily intuit that type of thing when you not only have a variety set of examples, but you also have the fundamental math structures and grasp of the dynamics of the system. So the pan is like the topological boundary in the last reference to the manifolds and topologies surrounding it. And the foil is like a convex manifold containing the flow in this case. So the fluid interactions are the vector fields adjusting to the neighboring molecule's motion and tempered by viscosity, like a bias or a weight, applied to machine learning. So machine learning functions based on weights and biases applied between nodes and activation functions and decision boundaries, depending on the type of machine learning model that you're using to fix your solution or to train your data or whatever. The slope, hydraulic pressures, even mixtures of colors in fluids, or even in solids if you mash them together, like Play-Doh. They're all practically identical to limited extra dimensions of the same set of dynamic and complex interactions. But like, why stop there? Understanding flows is no different from wave functions in particle physics, like I just said. So if you translate that extension to collapsing probability functions, you can apply probability functions inside of fluids that are hydrophilic, hydrophobic, on top of a topological structure from within a manifold, from within your kitchen, that's in your house, that's in your city, that's in your state, that's in your country, that's in your planet, anyway, etc. You can always add dimensions to whatever abstract notion that you're applying, and having a root understanding and intuition about how to transpose one idea from another or to another to apply a solution that's known for another problem to a solution that's not known for a new problem is fundamental to critical thinking and is hugely valuable just in the conduct of pursuing scientific progress. Regardless of the results of your specific project, just the act and process of doing it is beneficial in so many ways. So that's just one reason, but this is only a tiny slice of examples of how studying AI and programming can extend far beyond its specific applications. So clearly it's far from fleshed out, just sort of riffing here a bit, but I hope you can see how being able to conjure up ideas in the mind to visualize the applications of abstract math makes an intractable set of ideas tangibly relatable, and then hopefully tractable. The point of learning abstractions is to relieve that mental load it would otherwise take to just get a sense of complicated interactions of a completely different problem when you're already familiar with part of the solution and know exactly how to handle at least part right from the onset. So suddenly the mental load of a large problem gets partially lifted when you can apply abstractions and use intuitive analogies. So hopefully you'll gain enough of it to start picturing what it would mean programmatically or metaphysically or quantum mechanically to tilt a pan and predict how contents might respond to the forces you apply, just as the way you learn how containers holding fluids or carrying buckets of water might work. So, taking the same example of fluid flows and simplifying it a bit, gaining a thorough experience of oil and water in a pan solution might help you realize that fluid flows over edges and onto a ground. That wasn't a problem with your math or logic causing the spill, but rather might prompt you to check if the depth or boundary conditions of the pan maybe weren't sufficient for the application or practice that you were pursuing. So it's not just a random, well, it is kind of a random metaphor, but it's not just a metaphor. It's actually completely applicable in all directions, right down to the weight and the coating of the pan and the handle, the rust oxidizing off of it, creating some more interactions and chemical releases or what have you. Like, there's a lot that can be applied from that metaphor into math and abstracted out to show you how abstracting out math can help you in completely unrelated subjects or problem. But anyway, dead horse beaten. All I'm saying is that critical thinking is a key practice. Whether it's a Sudoku puzzles or creative writing or whatever it is you choose to do, it offers clues in how to adjust and reconfigure the experiment to get closer to achieving the expected or desired results, no matter what you're applying it to. So practicing abstraction skills is not just getting good at things that you're practicing, it's good for every other area of your life too, and that's sort of the point of what I'm dancing around saying. We should all make the point to take time for frivolous projects that make us think because it's in our best interest to do it. A crossword is a frivolous project. Nothing constructive is built from figuring out which words fit in a puzzle that's arbitrarily obscured. But the mental process of doing crossword puzzles is enormously beneficial, just like Sudoku puzzles or playing with code, technology or tinkering, hacking, whatever you want to call it. But it extends even further beyond just technical things. It's gardening and chemistry and exercise and fitness and nutrition and cooking, and all of these types of meditative practices are fundamentally good for our brains and for our health and for the health of general society at large by extension. So for a healthier society, we should be promoting more educational resources and more encouragement towards hobby projects, because it's good for the world that we do these types of things, and it makes us feel better. It makes us less stressed, less anxious. It's good for our brain health to fend off dysfunction. But ultimately, it also helps us think and find solutions and proofs to lessen the burden of life in general. So suffering. Technology eases suffering. Advancements in technology are advancements in quality of life, fundamentally, when they're not patented and copywritten and paywalled. But hopefully intellectual works don't have to be. If I can convince more of you to pursue my philosophy and my sciences, I would be a happy boy. So we should all make a point for more frivolous projects, not just for salaries or for making money off them, which you can do, there's nothing wrong with that, but we should do it just because it's in everyone's best interest to do it, for ourselves, our kids, our families, everyone. So let me try another example then. And feel free to check chapters down below and skip ahead if you've already heard enough reason to carry on. But for those of you who need a bit more bush beating, as I certainly always do, I've got a couple more examples for you. So I heard on the news earlier today that there was more record heat waves in cities around the world this year than ever before. And I've been hearing this, we've all been hearing this for several years in a row. Like, was it something like 10 of the last 15 have been the hottest in the last century or something ridiculous like that. So if you've done statistics before, you should realize that that's exceedingly unlikely to occur were it not for climate change. So anybody disputing climate change should have to provide at least tantamount evidence or more evidence to the contrary, which doesn't exist to my knowledge. But anyway, the point of this is the journalist reported that these temperature extremes were caused by rising global temperatures. And it's just in the choice of words that I sort of want to nitpick at, because that's the whole point of science and critical thinking, which I'm trying to get at from different angles here. So it's my estimation that global temperature rising are the result of climate change, but I bet most people would wrongly presume the rising global temperatures are causing the extreme weather around the world, given the phrasing of the report and judging by the anecdotal experience in most of the company I keep, at least. I would suggest that the global temperatures rising that they're referring to are actually measurements of temperature averages, because that's how I've always seen science journals remark on the irrefutability of climate change in the face of political inaction, is that average temperatures around the world have been rising steadily. So if average global temperatures are rising due to climate change, then I'm pretty sure that data on that are clear, then I'm pretty sure that that's probably caused by the extremely hot weather. In other words, the averages are going up because the extreme heat is going up in frequency, not the other way around. It's not because the planet is getting hotter that we're having more extreme heat. It's because we have more extreme heat that the averages are going up. They're both caused by climate change, but the wording makes the causal interaction sound different. Again, I'm not a climatologist, could be completely wrong. The point is the process of thought here. So don't take my words as some kind of, it's certainly not climate change denial or anything like that. It's a critique of how it's reported, and the word choice used, and the subtlety of those words could be easily misinterpreted, and that's the point. So critical thinking applied to even like news articles and things like that, I think is very important because it governs how people behave in their everyday lives and also their approach to fixing the problem. If somebody believes that rising global temperatures is causing extreme heat and the extreme heat is killing people, they might say, oh, well, we just need to block more sun, then we'll have less heat and it won't be a problem anymore. But that wouldn't fix the problem. If the problem is extreme heat because of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that's what's causing rising temperatures, blocking out the sun's not going to change trapped energy. It's just going to accumulate more slowly. Like, if it's not releasing, it's not releasing. And if you just keep polluting because you think you fixed the problem by putting a sunshade up over the planet, then you're patently wrong just based on that subtle difference of phrasing or terminology. So making relative comparisons in everyday life is a vital skill, and perhaps more important, a vital thing to notice instinctively when somebody is actively misrepresenting data to you. So protecting yourself from deception is every bit as important as digging a ditch that actually flows, like we were talking about before, or that driveway that slopes or whatever. It's important to know how to interpret data because understanding those subtleties of word choice and usage of data, they extend far beyond our everyday, they extend beyond just people's understanding of things. It's actually they materially affect our lives and our ability to plan for the future and for our planet. They're like existential concerns are being affected by the way we interpret data. Our existence depends on us understanding the scale and magnitude of pollution's effects on the Earth, and that the goal is best achieved by not being deceived. Even if in this instance the outcome and message are aligned, that won't always be the case, as we've seen with like hourly COVID statistics over the past 2 years, peddled on the news, without ever being told how those figures are being calculated. And it just led to a whole bunch of conspiracy theories about people lying and deceiving. And then people jump to these other conclusions, like the governments are tyrannical and they somehow get their rocks off on controlling people's access to social activities, as if that's what politicians get into politics for, is to control people. Like, I promise you, every politician is so vain and self-absorbed, they don't care at all about other people. That's why they're in politics. It's a popularity contest. We live in a democracy in Canada, where I'm from, and in the States, supposedly it's democratic. But like, if you actually believe your country is democratic, then who your leader is makes no difference. All they are is a singular person to have a phone number for other countries to call when they want to discuss something, so that they don't have to know like which individual is delegated to that type of issue from every office in every country. You go to the leader and the leader will delegate, They're a figurehead. They're not tyrants. And somehow we go from misinterpreting COVID statistics and analytics because of the way they're misrepresented, reported, or even intentionally misrepresented or reported. We go from that to conspiracy theory, to tyrannical government who wants to control me in my private home. And it's like, nobody catches the insanity. Just hundreds of millions of people follow along with these types of insane ideas, like vaccines are gonna, that they're just made up. And, the scientific evidence is right there, and all the data is right there, and they're independently verified by scientists across the world. Like, if you're not gonna believe in scientists, what are you doing investing in school? Like, why even bother have school in sciences if during a pandemic you're not going to trust the data that are produced independently around the world, or the reports, or anyway, I'm sure anybody who's on this channel is well aware that climate change and COVID are real, but what I'm getting at again is the process. The way they go about representing their data materially affects our lives, so it's in everyone's best interest to encourage this type of critical thinking, so that when we're presented with data, we don't just automatically dismiss it because we don't agree with it, or that it was presented wrong. It might still be right, but it takes critical thinking to say, I don't agree with how it's presented, but I still think it's accurate because the data are accurate. It's just the scales on the graph are exaggerating the results to make it more graphic or give it more emphasis to their claims, for one example, right? But the costs of this type of thing compounds due to insufficiently detailed information, despite hourly reports of statistics on the news worldwide that could have been prevented by educational programming instead of senseless daily charts. Like, if you have time to present a chart every single day, then why not just present one chart every week and then 4 segments of how to read charts? And by 2 years, everybody would have been statistical geniuses. Like, everybody would have had a bachelor's degree in stats and math. Had we actually taught people to read data and then told them where to find the data, they could have drawn their own conclusions and we wouldn't have to deal with these conspiracy theories and BS like that. But instead, they try and tell people what to think, and then people resist. They buck back. So I think we need to empower people towards science more than we're doing publicly. And that is one of the aims of this channel, hence me taking this long roundabout way of approaching that in this episode specifically, because I'm talking about my goals and motivations and aims for the channel and this type of research and why I'm publishing it and so on. So I'll give you another example, and that applies to critical thinking. And I'm not presuming by any means that I'm absolutely correct in my presumptions of their flawed methodology. As I said, I'm not a climatologist, nor was I provided the information I'm suggesting a reporter got wrong in that last instance. But just as a reference to the reporter had in mind, because it was also stated so matter-of-factly that it was expected that we just adopt their reasoning and line of thought. So what I'm doing here is just criticizing something I've heard rather than absorbing it, and that's the point. Not the point that I'm criticizing. The point is how to go about criticizing from different angles. So, yeah, because that's just bad thinking. So I have to criticize the other way they presented that whole, temperatures are rising, so heat extremes are becoming more frequent, that comment. So I find most people who claim to be critical thinkers, generally, just on a side tangent, they aren't, because they don't exercise it. They basically criticize one thing and then they say, haha, critical. And then they walk away like proud of themselves for it. And that's not how it works. It's just as important, if not more important, to criticize yourself and your own beliefs and thoughts as it is for others who are telling you things that they want you to believe blindly that they're true. So very much of this affects your life and family and ability to raise competent kids too, which I said before. So in case we still needed any more reasons to practice critical thinking, following a comprehensive research project such as this one might be good for that if you don't really know how to start, because teaching critical thinking, there are books and courses on it, but you can't learn how to do something like that without practicing it. And they don't very well tell you how to practice things in textbooks. They'll give you exercises, but the exercise specifically draws from what they just told you 5 seconds prior. So it's like you're not problem solving, you're just reference seeking. It's a totally different practice to check an index for something than it is to check for a concept of something. You know what I mean? Yeah, you know what I mean. So anyway, getting back to my second critique of that the climate thing. Tangent back. So one might be excused for assuming that if we had cooled the planet by shading it from the sun or whatever, that it would fix it, like I said before, but that does nothing to talk about the desertification that might be causing pockets of heat. Losing or gaining deserts and losing forest lands and grasslands, and having grazing animals affects grasslands. So you can prevent desertification in some areas by simply herding sheep and goats and stuff, not just from the shade that a whole roaming, I don't know what you call them, herd, I guess. Not just the shade that provided by the roaming herd, but they trample the grass, they flatten it down, it covers itself, then there's feces, and then there's, bugs and anthills that come on the feces, or whatever. There's a whole, dynamic, integrated ecology that behind the desertification of our landscapes that goes completely ignored. They just overly simplify really complex dynamic systems like jet streams and urbanization for one. You're going to trap way more heat in concrete than you are in grass. So by consequence, if our cities are getting bigger and our populations are getting bigger and we're building more roads and rail and infrastructure and things like that, it stands to reason that we're trapping more heat than we ever did before because of our infrastructure alone. And it's not like I'm saying we should tear down skyscrapers, but it makes sense to know a cause, for realsies, rather than assuming a cause based on the simplest possible explanation you can find. Occam's razor is really useful when you're trying to break down a problem that you have no idea what the solution is, or if you need to take some statistical relevance, take action on something that's most likely because there is no way of knowing. Then it makes sense to take the most simple solution because you can only eliminate so many options, and then it wouldn't make sense to take the most complicated one. The most unlikely is not likely, right? That's just by definition ipso facto. So, but in other cases, when you're talking about things that are measurable, and when you have like thousands of researchers around the world capable of actually coming up with experiments and testing all of these different theories, there's no reason to just jump to the simplest conclusion. You've got the funding, you've got the specialists and the experts, and you've got the academic infrastructure in the pedagogy across the world to actually look at these things. So do it. Like, why jump to the simple conclusion just because it's easier? The other thing with urbanization too is the pollution created from concrete. Like, one of the biggest carbon emissions in the world is from concrete production right now. So even if not just the energy trapped from urban areas and zones and development and buildings and roads and things like that, think of the exacerbation of the problem just in creating these cities and making them bigger and fixing them and repairing them. Like, how much energy we waste fixing roads that we could have made stronger, but we were just too cheap to make stronger roads. I don't know about other cities, but here in Winnipeg, we do it every year, road construction. I'm pretty sure it's like that in many cities across the world. But annual road construction, even though it may be cheaper and easier to budget for every year, it's way less cost effective if you factor in the cost of the climate. And then, not to mention labor costs and planning costs and administrative costs. And then there's like administration involved in just managing the money to fund these projects year over year, when if you did a 20-year fix or a 15-year fix in 1 year, you wouldn't have to pay for like accountants every single year to manage a project, right? It goes the same for project managers and stuff. It goes the same for the pollution. And having roads break down doesn't mean that you fix them the day they're broken. So it also comes down to like vehicle repairs for like the small potholes before it's bad enough that you rip up the road and redo it. You're causing extra wear and tear on all these vehicles, and all these vehicles then in turn have to go to shops, and then there's labor and accounting and, you know, repairs and maintenance to vehicles and yada, yada, yada. It's a complex dynamic system. And what we're dealing with partial differential equations and fluid flows and machine learning algorithms is interactions of complex dynamic systems. So understanding how to think critically about complex dynamic systems in a rigorous mathematical way helps us extrapolate that to make common sense approach decisions toward real life things that are causing real life changes in our environment. And I don't say that just to be like a Greenpeace tree hugger, oh, my environment. I'm saying like very literally our source of food and energy supplies are dependent, not just related, they are dependent on the environment. So it behooves all of us to actually pay attention to it, no matter how hokey it sounds or how hippie it sounds. Just do it. That's the responsible scientific thing to do. When there's data and correlation that suggests that there's an issue that's solvable and, you know, tractable that we can deal with, and that there's evidence and experts and, you know, there's data everywhere on it. Just do it. Don't be lazy. Don't jump to the simplest conclusion. You got to think critically. Whether you believe something or not, you got to disbelieve your own ideas and your own thoughts and your own doctrines as well. Critical thinking just isn't about other people's ideas. It's about our own ideas. And projects like this are hopefully really good at just sifting through all of that and figuring out how to draw up heuristics and measurements and observations and how to document properly what you are observing, how to theorize about problems, how to not be deceived, how to raise competent kids, like I said before, how to relate to people you're trying to teach things to. So instead of fighting and bickering with this bipolarity we have in the politosphere these days, learning how to speak to other people properly is far more productive, causes less stress and anxiety just socially speaking, and it makes more sense just generally speaking to engage with people in discourse rather than disdain. It makes more sense to know how to think and communicate ideas clearly and rationally, just for the sake of communication and for quality of life. So practicing these types of things would not only improve the world and our lives and our families and by extension the future, it also improves dialogue. Like the emotional aspect of qualia in our everyday lives are affected directly by our ability to communicate and think rationally and critically. There's nothing wrong with being emotional, but when you can't have a conversation with somebody about an opposing point of view, like in politics or in Supreme Court justices and law and things like that, then you're lost. You have no reason to say anything, because all you're doing is saying, I believe this, and you're basically throwing your hands in the air making noise because you can't articulate a thought. Or you're not thinking it through, and that's why you can't articulate the thought. But whatever the reason is, practicing this type of thing in structured, formalized fashion, whether you're an expert at it or not, whether you're formally educated or not, is great practice for everybody. And I think more people should encourage this type of like hobby projects, because when we can identify to differentiate our opinions from objectivity and delineate what can be known from what is known, or how much it can be known, or how subjective our beliefs are, then we can love and appreciate a band and still believe they are the best act ever to hit the stage, while also still acknowledging the limits of our knowledge, or the limits of that being a possible statement to know. I mean, art is subjective, but there are artists who are better than other artists. But it's not for one person to interpret and decide and think that they know truth. Recognizing our own human fallibility makes us less susceptible to causing harm on other people, either voluntarily or involuntarily, through the way we speak to them about our opinions, right? And I'm not perfect by any means. I actually struggle greatly with this type of thing. Interpersonal relationships I've had have been stressed because of my inability to articulate compassionately with other people, because when I'm passionate about something, I want the stimulus of the aggression, but not everybody's like me, and I had to learn that. The way I learned to relate to other people was to recognize when the way I was presenting my ideas and my opinions was hurting other people, and figuring out a way to do it more dispassionately and more objectively helped me not just maintain, but strengthen relationships with people, because we could keep talking instead of it escalating, but also it helped them understand me, which was the whole point of my communication. So if you're sincere about your wanting to be heard and speaking for the sake of connecting with other people, it's really important to know how to think critically so that you can communicate to other people's communication styles, so that you can keep communicating with them without things, exploding for some unknown cause. Well, unbeknownst to you, obviously, the other person knows exactly what pissed them off, but so there's a lot of extended benefits to doing this type of objective, rational thinking as a practice. And it's not that you have to do it constantly or all the time, because it can be like a mental headache or whatever. But it's really important to have it in the background, or have it as a tool that you can just pick up, use it, and put it back down. Like to be able to switch back and forth, like bilingualism between languages. It's really helpful in just... it enhances your relationships, your quality of life, your mental health, and by extension, like I said, the world around you and all that. So crucially, I want to stress that I'm not by any means suggesting that people who study programming or math are impervious to the pitfalls of the human condition. By nature, we all suck at processing numbers in our heads. That is why we write math down in calculations. We've evolved an aptitude for processing symbols and visual stimuli, which enables us to do math and programming, but that doesn't mean we're good at it. Those things just in turn lead us to fantastic feats of engineering, because it's the critical thinking that made it possible, and our visual acuity and our ability to manipulate symbolic representations of abstractions. That's what did it. It has nothing to do with being good at math or being bad at math. It has nothing to do with being able to do these calculations in your head, because our brains aren't built to be good at that. Our brains are barely capable of doing math, but we're able to do it well enough that we can write it down, and we can come up with syntactical structures that make it a language of its own. Like you can manipulate the terms of the phrase to draw out the same meaning in different ways, and in those different shapes of the same meaning, you can extrapolate out into other meanings, right? So math isn't something that you even need to know well. If you know how to use it, it might just take you longer, but your answer will be the same as the expert who did it in 5 seconds. It's a process that's methodical and logical and rational, but we're all capable of rationality, methodology, and I forgot what the third thing I just said was, but anyway, you get the point. So this brings me to my next point about critical thinking, and I promise I'll try not to draw it out too much longer. I think I've been ranting for about an hour already, but anyway, it's important. I've gone this long. It probably doesn't make any difference. If somebody's watching to this point, they'll either keep watching or change, but anyway. So the other point I wanted to make is that doing science doesn't mean being right. Science is not creating reality, it's just describing it. Reality is whatever it is, whether you describe it or not, whether you know how to measure it or not, whether you have a word for it or not, it's still there. So just because you're a trained scientist or you're a credentialed professional expert researcher doesn't mean that you're right and someone else who has just a high school education or dropped out of high school even is wrong. Because if the data they collected was done properly, and if the analysis was done properly, and the math is completely done properly, there's no difference between this person's results and the other person's results. There might be a difference in interpretation, but that has nothing to do with expertise. Every person is capable of a different interpretation, right? And that's crucial to know, because if you come up with a science project as part of your hobby and you finish it and you're trying to get it published and people aren't publishing it, that's a problem with the system. That's not a problem with your science per se. If they come back and say, I'm not publishing this because your data are wrong, or they were collected poorly, or you need to learn how to do integral calculus a little bit better or something, like that's different. But I mean, if both have the exact same paper, I mean, which isn't obviously impossible, I'm just saying hypothetically as a thought experiment, if a PhD physicist has the same paper as I do in a machine learning project or a psychology PhD or something like that, it doesn't mean that they're more right because of their credentials. It just means that they went to school longer and they probably came to the conclusion a lot easier than I did. But we're all in it together. Like, that's the other focus to this channel and this project is right now scientific journals and papers are exclusively being published by like professional seasoned scientists. And a lot of the work that gets published like does require that type of background knowledge for nothing more than just like the complexity of the subject matter. Like, I mean, 300 years ago, there was only so much math to learn. It was something you could probably figure out in your bedroom, right? Up until like Newton and Leibniz did calculus, most of the math was accessible to today's teenagers. I mean, they had to discover it, so it's a completely different level of, math when you have to like derive proofs and stuff. But I'm just saying like the usage of it, right? And they didn't have the symbols. They had to create the symbols and the rules for the syntax. So it was a much harder project for them. But what I'm getting at though is if the numbers match up and align exactly the same, and the conclusion is drawn directly from the numbers in the exact same rationality, it doesn't matter who brings it up, because science is science regardless of the source. That's really, really important. Because, like I said, the science journals and the scientific community is getting really hoity-toity. Even faculties in the universities, like they won't talk to you until you pay tuition. That's not what universities are meant for. They were established as public institutions with public funding to pursue knowledge. I mean, you pay tuition so that you can go to classes and get teacher attention and all that. But if somebody comes up with groundbreaking research, it's flat out denied. Like, it won't even get looked at because, oh, you're not paying me, or you're not tenured, or And that to me is just, it's wrong on a fundamental, on a principled level for the ethos and purpose, the raison d'etre of the university. Universitas is like veritas for the universe, you know? Like the whole point of the establishment and structure wasn't just to credential people to get jobs so that they can command a higher pay. And it wasn't just for rich kids to have fun and, you know, throw some money around in their early 20s. There's a purpose and a social function to higher education, and that's not to say having fun is wrong, or getting a good job with credentials is wrong, or demanding higher pay because you spent 7 years in school and wrote a dissertation and a thesis is wrong. Nothing wrong with that. But to make a university exclusive to that, to make publication exclusive to access through a university, when you have a pay-to-play and you have a publish or perish system where, like, to stay in academia you need to keep getting published, that's terrible for all of humanity. That's a terrible approach to science and education, like, at large. And that's where we're moving towards, because everything now depends on funding, and funding is being scaled back from governments and largely being supported by corporations who, by and large, spend enormous sums of money avoiding paying taxes. Like, you have to see that the tax burden falls on somebody, and that comes back down to the people who are trying to get good jobs by paying for school. So, like, the whole system is like a recursive downward slope. And that's not in anyone's best interest. So I want to change that. I want the scientific community to become more open source, more license free, more community driven, where we help each other, not just competing with each other and, like, hoarding our ideas so that we're the first to publish it or anything like that. Who cares if you're the first? Who cares if you get a mention? Just publish your paper too. We need peer review just as much as we need groundbreaking research. There shouldn't be this higher standard or, you know, awards ceremony for people who are the first to anything, because then all you're doing is encouraging people to come up with BS headline type research. Chocolate gives you cancer. Chocolate solves cancer. Coffee gives you cancer. Coffee solves cancer. Like, that type of science doesn't benefit anybody. And then when you've got all the best science being published by companies like Monsanto or whatever, who within their best interest to have you align with their points of view, and then they refuse to allow you to publish something that doesn't fit into their economic model. Again, that doesn't help anybody. The science is done. The expert did their jobs. Yeah, people got paid, but the research goes out the window just because a company decides it doesn't benefit them, and they're mandated to seek profit. It's not that companies or corporations are bad. You can't have your scientific body, a public good, being governed and funded solely, exclusively, nothing wrong with somewhat, but exclusively by these groups, because they're not built to be social organizations. They're built to seek profit. And if they own the research, why would they publish it if it damages their company's business model? Like, when Facebook did the psychological surveys of people who used their products, it was much along the same lines. They just disregarded the research because it didn't benefit them at all or their business plan, and they were already losing subscribers, and they already had a ton of bad publicity from the Cambridge Analytica scandal, among many others. So, like, yeah, they've got ad models, and they do tons of analytical research and tons of AI analysis of the data they collect, and they are a data-driven company. All of their value is based on their troves of data on individual people and the way they sell that to other advertisers and other companies. So why would they harm themselves with their own data if their company mandate is to fulfill shareholders' wishes to seek profit? Like, by law, they're not even allowed to do it, even if somebody there wanted to. The whole board would have to sign on to it. Yes, please damage my portfolio. Put my job at risk. Nobody would do that. If you didn't have to work for 6 figures a year, why would you put that in jeopardy over a research paper that anybody else could do on their own, independently? Except they can't because they don't have the data. But that's a huge problem in our society, and just because we don't see it and it's not front row and center every day, these BS headlines and tabloid headlines of scientific research drive me absolutely mental, because they don't mention the methodology half the time, they don't mention the constraints, they sensationalize the headline, they draw their own conclusions, and then thousands, if not millions, of other people who, a lot of them I know, will claim they've read the research because they read an article about the research, and the article just patently misrepresented the entire project that was done. And that's like potentially years of like a team of people's lives dedicated to like meticulous detail and analysis, and it's just thrown out the window for a clickbait article so that they can throw ads in between every sentence of that article. Like, they don't even write paragraphs for articles anymore. It's 1 or 2 sentences, ad. Next paragraph, 1 or 2 sentences, ad. Like, all of our educational system is not, it's not the age of information like we imagined it to be. The age of information is data, but it's marketing. It's data for profit. It's not data for knowledge. We're not enlightened by it. We're not better off by it. Marketing is strictly a mass psychology manipulation move. It's not just telling you their product exists. They're telling you what to think about the product, how to feel about the product, when to buy it, who should buy it. Like, all of this is, it's a necessary evil to salesmanship. I get that. But the extent that it's gotten to, where you can't even sit at home in your own home and turn on a media player without an ad turning on. Like, when I bought a Discman or a CD, I would turn it on and play through my whole CD, not one ad. You can't even get these albums anymore without downloading digital albums, and the digital albums have digital rights management on them, and they have ads embedded in the MP3s or the FLAC files you get. Or you've got a Spotify subscription and there's ads between every... or you pay for a premium service and there's no visual ads, but as soon as you look in the comments, like the first thing above the comments is an ad. You know what I mean? Or just reading articles, like you can pay for a subscription to a newspaper, you'll still get all the ads in between every paragraph in an article. That's obscene. We should be objecting to this vehemently, especially when it comes to educational resources and the reporting of scientific exploration. Like, I probably already went too deep into that anyway. But the point is, it's insanely destructive. And if you don't see that it's insanely destructive, check into any one of these arguments that I'm making and just look them up in depth. Because every one of them has like layers and layers upon layers of profiteering and paywalling that's preventing scientific progress. Like, the biggest one was, what was it? When they were going to release the new Xbox and PlayStation consoles, when the pandemic hit, like right before the chip shortage, there was a GPU shortage, and that GPU shortage was manufactured. They intentionally did not release GPUs, graphical processing units, that they had sitting idle, that were already built and ready to go, because they wanted to wait for the release of the consoles, because they had a licensing agreement that required that the consoles be the most advanced on the market when they launched. Well, that's all well and good in normal circumstances, but when you're using high-end GPUs for data analytics and AI, already we've been using them for this, and there's a pandemic, and you need to analyze billions upon billions of data points as quickly as possible, holding back GPU sales actually killed people. Like, people died prematurely because we didn't have access to information processing units. Just so that consoles could launch video games which have ads in them and apps that you can't get rid of, like Disney Plus and Hulu and stuff. You can try to erase them, they won't let you. You buy the console, but you still they own your ad space in your home. That's obscene, and it's absurd. But like, that's people's choice to buy these things, no problem, I boycott them. But the fact of the matter is, that affected scientific research during a pandemic. An emergency, a global emergency, was affected strictly by companies manipulating markets. And that to me should bother everybody. Not because it would have fixed this, or I'm not going to do any counterfactuals like that. The only fact I know is that research helped develop a vaccine. Research helped develop protocols to prevent infections. Research helped develop ways of treating patients who came in with COVID. Like ideas like turning them on their front and proning saved 80% of people having to need ventilators? I don't know the exact number. But at the time, ventilators were in such short supply, if you'll remember, people were dying because they didn't have ventilators. And 60 or 80% of them, more than half of them, might have or would have, based on the statistics. You can't say for sure because dead people don't come back and try again. But statistically, at least half of them would have survived without a ventilator had they been proned. But we didn't know about proning because we didn't have enough data analytics. And we didn't have that partially because the highest end GPUs available to us, the most powerful units that we needed for exactly this type of raw data analysis, were unavailable due to consoles that wanted to make sales. And the crux of it, they didn't even have enough units for these consoles to sell. So we had to wait for the launch of these consoles before they finally released the GPUs that scientists needed. And they didn't even have enough consoles for the next 2 years to sell to people. There was a shortage of consoles. So just mind-numbingly stupid. From a species, from a world view, looking down from, 3,000 feet. It's just insane. So, yeah, there are so many examples. Other than climate change deniers in Senate in the States, and virus protocols, obviously, there's gun control debates, extremist views of defunding the police or denying police brutality as racially motivated. Despite all of the statistics and evidence and allegations spanning several lifetimes, I learned about it in the 90s when I listened to hip-hop music in high school. I knew it was there. I knew it was a problem. But nobody who wasn't listening to people telling these stories believed it until they saw videos from smartphones. You didn't need smartphones, you just had to look. All it took was some critical thinking and a little bit of analysis and to read published documented science to know that there was an issue with police brutality and racially motivated police brutality, not to mention. But it's everything down to the school system's funding methods and common core test practices, privatized healthcare, schools offering the most money to the highest performing schools, absolutely backwards compared to what the data would tell us is in the best interest of, again, our population. So it may not be in the best interest for the kids who are doing well, but the money is not going to change how much more they learn. There's a law of diminishing returns, and we're going to get into a lot of economics and theory and stuff because my foray into math and derivatives came through finance. That's when it finally clicked for me. So I'm assuming that for many others, maybe even people who aren't interested in watching markets or doing technical analysis on charts and stuff, you'll at least appreciate the fact that it makes understanding complex issues like derivatives and integrals a lot easier to follow because we all understand prices and buying and selling. So it's just more relatable, I guess. But anyway, getting back to the education thing, yeah, it's or even privatization of schools is bad enough, but privatization of public works and utilities when they've consistently proven to fail the public and need bailouts despite profiteering for years before going bust, like PG&E in California, who couldn't afford to fix their own gas leak and let it leak and then denied it was leaking for months and months. People got sick, and then they just declare bankruptcy or whatever when all is said and done. But they cashed out the whole way. Or Texas's power grid. They could have built a more resilient power grid. Snow doesn't destroy... I live in the north, in Winnipeg, in Canada. We get lines go down, sure. We never have power outages for, weeks on end or anything like that. You get a ground fault and it just reroutes. You can build resilient power lines that are resistant to snow. Well, we're in Texas, we barely ever get... Yeah, but when you do get snow, people die. When your lines go down... and people don't have heat at all for months at a time, people die. And to privatize that and say, oh, we get like 3 cents cheaper electricity. No, you don't. Look at the data. You pay more for electricity than I do here in Canada. Like, to talk about things on a relative, coherent basis requires some type of critical thought and analytical skills. And these types of skills may be taught in a book, and they say you should think about different perspectives and different ways of looking at things. That doesn't at all, in any way, shape, or form, teach you how to actually look at something differently or new. And that's the problem. It tells you how to write the right answer on a test to get a good score in your critical thinking class. It does not teach you how to think critically about anything outside of that class. I've got so many other examples, like with college tuitions and Fox News and, you know, the impotence of law enforcement of like the alphabet agencies like the FDA, CIA, FTC, CFTC, all that. But like, what am I? I'm at like an hour and 20 minutes or something already, so maybe I'll just move along. So, but anyway, this is why this channel is, and this project are important to me. It's the meta aspect of promoting science to an average Joe public school graduate to encourage not only a solution to our data problems and solving the AGI problem of intractable computational requirements, or even methodology. We don't even know how to go about it. Even if we had the computing power of the universe, we wouldn't know which algorithm to implement, but that's neither here nor there. GPT-3 probably thinks that they could do it, but they're really just, oh, let's use more parameters. Let's use even more parameters. Like, that's their solution to everything, and you're not optimizing if your only solution is to do more of the same. But anyway, that's for them to do, not me. That's why I don't have a supercomputer. I don't need one. So yeah, that's the point of this project. I think fundamentally that's my motivation, is to promote science to average people and try to break down the walls of this gated community of academia. It's also to point out that this project is accessible to anyone who wants to work at bettering themselves and the world by protecting themselves from manipulation, conceit, deception, that type of thing. Like, we all live better lives. We'll all live better lives and make better decisions if we do this type of work. And without regulating free speech, we won't even have to worry about the insane things people say. If at least half of the world we just slightly more critical in their thinking. And by regulating free speech, I'm sort of referring to like Facebook and Twitter, and you know, what you can and can't say now is getting absurd. The whole cancel culture thing. Destroying somebody's life over misspeaking it's absurd. It's such nonsense. And we're going to look back in, 50 years in history and think like, how are these people like dressing themselves in the morning if they thought that we should destroy people's lives over putting black paint on their face in high school? Like, the high school didn't suspend them because it was totally normal back then. Like, relativity matters. Einstein taught us that, like, as a fundamental principle of space-time and all of physics. Relativity matters and frame of reference matters. But it's like critical thinking is out the window these days. There is no frame of reference. Everything is just viewed from today's perspective. And if you just apply today's perspective, then you're missing all of the context. Context and intent are substantive. That's why law has degrees of murder. But anyway, that's another side tangent or whatever. It should be obvious and clear by now that thinking properly matters more than knowing what to think. If you can figure out how to derive an equation rather than memorizing the equation, you're far better off and you're far more useful than just having like a, what do you call that? Like a reference list, a cheat sheet just memorized in your head that you can just, map from one to the other like a hash table. Oh, I need compound interest? That's this formula. If you know how to figure out the compound interest formula, like principal times 1 plus the rate to the power of the number of amortization periods over times the amount of time, something like that. But if you can figure out why that formula works, you don't have to memorize the formula because you can just kind of like figure it out as you go along. You'd be like, well, There's the principal to my debt, there's the rate of interest, which has to multiply against the principal, and then to compound it, I'm going to need some type of exponent. Well, the exponent's going to have to multiply the amortization periods with the total duration of the loan, so that's my exponent. Like, if you can think about it that way, then math isn't just some obscure collection of Greek characters. The Greek characters are actually concise forms and symbols for larger thoughts that you already know and understand, so that you don't have to write out large words and then figure out like an equation this long for something that could be written in this tiny box, right? So like the whole point to it isn't to sound complicated or to look smart, knowing all the proper terms and using the biggest words you can think of. The reason science has big words is the specificity of terms. It's useful to have one big word than to write a whole paragraph describing a common theme that everybody in the field should already know. It's useful to have a specific word, even if it's big or long and hard to say. It's far better to have that than have to re-describe and reinvent the wheel every time you want to speak about something specific that maybe needs to be differentiated from something similar within the field, but that would change the entire dynamic and structure and meaning of what you were trying to say. So, yeah, I think that should be mostly what I have to say about that. I should let this go. But, yeah. The issues are clearly visible, though. I mean, we go to war over stuff like this. The war in Iraq is a clear example of misrepresented data causing mass murder. And then war crimes, which we don't try. Nobody went to trial for them. George Bush is still walking around free. And then we go off to war again and murder in the name of justice. Like, absolutely absurd how we elect these people, and we do it consistently because we consistently fail to apply critical thought, analytical thought. It's causing tremendous harm in the world. And projects like this, and helping encourage rather than discourage armchair physicists and armchair philosophers and hobbyist machine learning scientists and data scientists and analysts and market analysts, like encouraging people to do this type of work in their free time would be the best benefit to our society that we can think of. Because the types of people who gravitate to this type of work are the types of people who fix the problems in the world. They're also the type of people who can manipulate the systems in play and benefit from them and make them worse. So helping them think critically about like their life's ambitions and goals and what they want to get out of the energies they invest in their lives might do well for everybody else by extension too. Because the harm they cause is harm caused on everyone else. Like us, me, and you. Like, when somebody else causes harm or exploits a system or a group of people or extracts wealth from a market unduly by arbitrage, just because they've got an algorithmic trading formula that nobody else has, that doesn't add any benefit. It's from everybody else's sweat and toil and labor and productivity and invention and innovation and effort that they're gaining disproportionate wealth from. So when you say I can't afford to give you a raise, and then you give yourself a raise and your shareholders a raise and the arbitrage guy a raise, and he's already got a jet and a yacht, like what are you really encouraging in your capitalism? That's not capitalism. Capitalism's supposed to be meritocratic. The productive people are supposed to get rewarded for their productivity, for their merit, for their expertise, not the people who game the system the best. What we're doing is we're creating experts at gaming a system rather than creating experts at producing quality advancements or improvements or betterments to social goods. So it may sound kind of tangential to the project, but it's really important to focus on the extensions of our efforts. You can do something today that affects you tomorrow, but there's 1,000 years that come after tomorrow. If you can pay attention to the whole picture, the big picture, and what you do, you'll live a more fulfilling life. You'll live with more love, more integrity, more credibility, more honesty. And if you're into the whole legacy thing, like you want your name to survive through the times, the best way to do that is to not be a prick. You do it by changing the world for the better. You don't win points for accumulating more for yourself and restricting access to other people's quality of life because you want knowledge to be yours and not somebody else's. We should be spreading it freely. So dogma aside, that's pretty much where I'm coming from. The other important thing to this episode specifically, and I really have to stress this too, and I'll put the whole critical thinking aside now because, like I said, I beat that horse to death. What's really important about this is I need to articulate my biases going into this project because that's also part of science. So elaborating as loosely as I'm doing right now, although it may be long-winded and sort of annoying or provocative or whatever, it's telling you where I'm coming from the onset of this project, and every project should do this. You should always, and if you're not able to articulate specifically what your bias is because it's a latent or an unknown bias, you should articulate all of the angles of perspective that you have going towards this type of work. Because in future, if anybody wants to go back and figure out why you made this mistake or how you made this leap in judgment that you completely missed, they could correct it and solve the problem that you could never solve in your lifetime just because they figured out where your bias was that you couldn't see. We all have blind spots. That's the whole human fallibility thing. But with documentation and rigorous approach, we can build on each other's work and help each other out. Or put in other ways, we can exploit synergies. Cooperation is what made humanity as successful a creature as it is. Partially it was our big brains, yes, our use of tools, yes, our use of language, yes, but we use tools and language and our big brains to cooperate. The tool maker gave tools to other people and they all harvested more crops. The farmers who got really good at farming provided more food to more people to have more workers to do other things like make clothes and raise more livestock or whatever, like by extension, right? The more productive we are, the more we can produce for the species, the more they can produce back for us. The easier it'll be to extract minerals and energy resources, for example, without destroying the planet, is the better they are at extracting resources without destroying the planet. It's not something I can do because I'm not an expert extractor of resources. Do you know what I mean? But like, if I can do data science on behalf of them and then trade my knowledge with them, supply them with whatever I discover, or not even discoveries, like if I set a baseline down that they can start and build from, and some homeless kid in India figures it out on a Raspberry Pi, then we both win. Do you know what I mean? It's not about accolades or vanity. It's not a vanity project by any means. It's strictly speaking for the promulgation of knowledge and truth. And in that spirit, I think it's important, at least for me, to describe not just my socio-political views or my theocratic views, or I think it's important to note that I have some disdain for the academic community, but I revere them and I want to be a part of it. I just want to change the system to make it better than it is today. So it's not that I hate all of government, I just want to change it to make it better than it is today. And it's not that I hate, capitalism. I love capitalism. Like I owned a bank, an investment bank, and trading currencies and commodities futures. Like I love finance, but the way they're going about it is wrong, and it's broken, and it's fixable. So I'm specifying the ways that I think it could be fixed, but I'm also specifying my biases towards these types of institutions because it may affect or impact my research in ways that I can't foreshadow. So that's all part and parcel to this project. So moving on, I'm going to make a lot of references to economics through the course of this series. So just a fair warning, it's the most relatable mathematical abstractions I can think of to really wrap my brain around the continuous functions using price action and charting technical indicators of buy and sell signals and that kind of thing. It's universal data, it's updated to the minute or to the second really, with a massive set of historical points to filter through, and there's plenty to train an AI network on, so it's really useful for a free open source research project like mine where you need a whole bunch of data and you got no budget to pay for it. So I should also warn you that we're going to be talking philosophy and ethics from time to time. I know most people cringe at just the mere mention of it, but in order for us to responsibly prepare this kind of algorithm that generalizes to all things, you absolutely must discuss the ethical approaches and not approaches, but ethical considerations. Well, I'll give you an example because I can't quite articulate it. They had an AI process like hand soap dispensers, right? So that they didn't waste hand soap. So I guess maybe smaller hands dished out smaller soap or whatever. But the training was only done on white people, so the sensors didn't recognize black people as well or readily as white people. And some black people took offense to it because it was like, your machines are discriminating against us and you guys don't even care to fix them kind of thing. So like a lot of people disregarded it as, oh, it's just a soap dispenser, like get over it. But when you really think about it, what it is saying is that we only need to engineer things to work for some people and not others. Like we should consider it a problem when our machines don't work universally, not because it's like a big deal that soap doesn't come out because, you know, it's soap, whatever. It's a big deal that people are being ignored based on fixable constraints. Like, we just train the system better. Like, it has nothing to do with the ability of the machine to dispense soap. It has to do with software. So, if the software doesn't work, you fix it. And it doesn't matter how important it is to you. If it doesn't work universally, it doesn't work universally. It's a broken system, so fix it. This isn't about like, oh, it works well enough. This is about aggregating data for the best use of all people, not just most people or some people, but all people, as much as is possible, you know what I mean? So it's really important to keep discrimination in mind, not just for like soap dispensers, but for things like autonomous vehicles. Huge. The trolley problem is a really severe problem that we're going to have with machine learning. When a vehicle has to decide between veering to the left and killing one child or veering to the right and killing 3 adults, we need to know how our machine is calculating that, and we need to all agree on whether or not that's an okay calculation for it to make before we have cars driving on the road on their own. You know, ethical considerations are very, very important. And some ways of developing neural networks, the weights and biases are generated as part of the training process. So like we don't engineer them discretely or explicitly ourselves. They're developed throughout the, with deep neural nets, this is a common issue. So it's important to know that when we have a black box algorithm that doesn't tell you what it's doing to come up with its output from its input, you really got to understand the ethics behind what that system might do in cases that you don't even consider fringe cases. Because without seeing the instance come up, again, it's like having a latent bias. You're just blind to it. So ethics delve a lot into philosophy, and all of science is technically philosophy in my opinion, because originally philosophy was all of science, but I think even more pragmatically now, because the scientific method itself is a philosophical approach. So I think all sciences are subsets of philosophy, so it's impossible to engage in a scientific research project of any magnitude without discussing the philosophical implications as well, because they're like quarks. You can't separate them. If you separate a quark, the energy it takes to remove the quark from itself creates another quark, because energy equals mass times the speed of light square. So if you take that much energy, it'll become mass as you try and separate them. Philosophy and sciences are a lot like that. If you try and take philosophy out of science, it would require a philosophy in order to do that, is what I'm getting at. And if you tried to take science away from philosophy, the same thing would happen. You'd need a methodical process of removing science from philosophy, and that itself would be a science. So you can't separate science from philosophy the same way you can't separate two quarks from one another without generating two more quarks on both sides, without generating a new science and a new philosophy. That's sort of a perfect analogy, if I may say so myself. So most of all, I think this channel's videos will serve to emphasize the process of self-directed education and the true value of the internet's vast resources beyond cat videos, NFTs, and binge streaming to discontinue cable TV shows. If you're not already good at this type of thinking because you weren't raised that way or haven't practiced or believe you weren't born that way or whatever, I'm telling you here and now, that doesn't matter. You can learn. Everybody can learn how to be rational. At least I've never met a person who's incapable of it. We're all human, and we all have different abilities, but our capacity for the general rationale, our capacity to learn is not different. It's just the speed or the readiness or our eagerness to learn might be different. The things that stick, like the approaches, like the methods that we learn, might be different. But we're all capable of it. I might just need more time to learn something like math than most other people, but I can prove to you that I'm not incapable of learning math because of it. If I have difficulty reading, doesn't mean I can't read or I can't write. It just means it's harder for me. But it also means that perhaps that type of difference in my personal constitution might be the thing that gives me an insight that other people's have missed. So it's not a reason to not do science because something's hard or you're not good at it or it's not natural to you. That might actually be the reason you should do it, because you're more likely to have a different perspective or approach than somebody else. And if most of the experts all come from the same background and they're all struggling at finding a solution with global problems, like the mind-body problem in philosophy, or, how to structure market systems in economics, the whole Keynesian and, Austrian economics or whatever. Like, every field has these unanswered questions from the field. And a lot of people tend to assume that you have to be naturally gifted to be the one to come up with the solution to this type of thing. And often that is the case, where those people like Turing are the ones who come up with these genius solutions that nobody else could think of. But also quite often it's the people who struggle with it the most, or who came up from unlikely backgrounds, who wind up being the ones who found that one linchpin that was preventing everybody else from their latent biases from figuring it out. And it's because maybe I don't have an academic background that I might be able to solve a problem that somebody else hasn't been able to so far. And again, that's not the point. If all you did was peer research, or peer-reviewed research, if all you did was copy what other people do and test it yourself, following their methods, that's just as important as inventing something new, even if 1,000 people have already done it. Because now there's 1,001 data points. That's what science is. It's not just discovery. Discovery is just the sexy part of science. But the important part of science is the reproducibility. And the only way to know if something's true or not is that it's reproducible, and reproducible by anyone, not just reproducible by the one person who discovered it. So, what else? I don't know, I guess that's probably it. It's been, what, an hour and 45 minutes. Yeah, that's probably it. I'll wrap up. But if you've listened this long, thanks for tuning in. You get a piece of my insights, or my insides, whichever. I think the greatest impact the internet has on the world, just as a final comment here, is the ability for us to transmit experiences and educations instantaneously, and with like some type of objective permanence. Now, I'm not saying everything's permanent, because obviously the world could get wiped out or whatever, but as permanent as things can be in this world, it's not like a book that can get lost in a fire in Alexandria or something. Like, it's really neat how all of human consciousness and awareness and experience can be transmitted and shared between one another. And I think I want to be on the side of history that tried to use it for good as well as entertainment. Entertainment's all well and good. It's healthy to have fun and let your mind go a little bit, but it's equally important to contribute, in my opinion. So if you do any of this type of research, just throw it online, whether it's in a blog post to help practice writing, or whether it's a formal publication that you get rejected from science journals, or YouTube videos where you go off on 2-hour rants about your philosophical perspectives, whatever. Even if you're just tuning in to learn some Canadian English with my accent, just help spread the word. It would really mean a lot to the channel and the project. Help show me that you appreciate, if you appreciate it, but, show the internet that you appreciate some more of this sort of content, even if not mine, but others doing similar works, because it might inspire one of those geniuses to like put down a video game controller and then, fix climate change maybe by discovering some type of bacteria that eats plastic or whatever. But other than that, just drop me some feedback down below, whether good or bad, or just to say hi. It prompts the algorithm, any type of engagement, like a comment, a like, or a share, or anything like that. I'm not going to beg you. I'm not going to do any advertising on this channel. I'm not going to take sponsorships or promotions. I don't want my integrity ever being called into question. And this channel specifically for my research project, and I don't want to taint my project with some corporate BS or, some nonsense about me being a stooge. So, yeah, all the support I can get is going to be from comments, likes, and shares, and hopefully YouTube can help promote my wares and maybe some brand recognition, I guess. In the interest of being completely transparent, I have published a couple books and an album, just indie stuff, again, hobby work. So if you do really want to support me and help me do this type of research, you can always check out my website. Links in the description, because I do get royalties from that, and it would make me feel pretty good if you read the book and dropped a comment or something on it. So rather than having a Patreon or sponsors, just do that if you're really inclined to throw some cash down and say thanks. But I sincerely don't expect it. I'm not going to be promoting my wares or pushing any of that stuff. I might throw it on the thumbnail and just leave it there, so people can look for it if they want, but I'm not going to push it. What else? Yeah, I guess in the next episode I'll describe some of the tools and software we'll be using, because that'll be pretty important. I won't go through like how to use it all, because each one will probably take its own video. But listing them off at least so that you're familiar with them, and then maybe you can tinker with them or know which ones you've already used before, which ones you haven't. But I'll explain the main ideas I alluded to at the beginning of this episode. I had 2 key ideas in how to progress with the optimisations that nobody's done yet, and that I wanted to pursue just out of personal interest. So I want to cover that in depth, how I envision the implementation is going to roll out moving forward. So what else? I'll be talking a lot about open source projects too. Open source is just software written by either donations to foundations of software developers, or independent groups or individuals even sometimes, who produce really functional software like OBS, which I'm using to record this, and almost all YouTubers, I think, are using, well, streaming YouTubers, I mean, are using OBS for things like podcasts and game recordings, and especially with streaming video games is really popular, I hear. But that's an open source project too. And again, they've got some corporate BS where a company tried to steal their name, the style of their website, and they reused all the code from OBS and slightly changed the name, and they're selling it so people think that it's a paid for program, but you get a full-featured OBS studio without paying for it. So if you're getting into game streaming or something and you paid the license, you didn't have to. But other than that, yeah, I'm going to be talking about markets a lot too. And lots of theory, because there are different types of neural networks and like support vector machines and perceptron models. Like there's all types of different machine learning models, like structures or methodologies. The graph neural nets are really interesting, but I haven't gotten into them yet. They seem a lot more complicated than the other types, but that might just be my own fear of graphs, because I haven't ever done them before, mathematically speaking, like the traveling salesman problem or Dijkstra's pathfinding algorithm are pretty much as far as I've ever gone into that. So that should be fun. It's probably, I'm just building it up to be worse than it is in my head, as I tend to do. But there are roughly like 20 different types of models, and I'm going to try at least 10 of them. And currently I only know about 4 of them, so it's going to be a long slog. But using the tools I create and the implementation methods that I hopefully can apply through Blender 3D modeling software, it should be really quick to implement them after the fact, because once you've got the code and everything lined up, you've basically set up all of your data and your training formatting and things like that, and then you're going to use those same matrices and other algorithms. And because I'm going to be using open source frameworks for the other algorithms, knowing how they work is important, but it's not a requirement. Like, it's not prerequisite to even implementing them. You can go on to like TensorFlow, and within 15 minutes, you can walk through step by step and how to set up the MNIST database to do you can train your own model to read handwritten numeric digits in one afternoon if you just go on the website. So like, you can do a step-by-step instructional tutorial and just have machine learning up and running in a day. But this video series is going to be to understand the structure from underneath so that we can generate an algorithm that is built of an AI that manages a bunch of other AI networks. That's essentially the idea. So understanding them from the ground up is going to help me configure the compositional AI, the one on top that manages everything else. Yann LeCun is one of the godfathers of machine learning. He just released a paper similar to this idea, so I'm struggling to get my stuff out now just as a friendly competitive thing, because I would be so proud if I was even in the same league as that man, but apparently he's on a similar train of thought as mine, so hopefully one day I'll be able to banter with him a bit over our competing models. But anyway, that's that. Peace out. Thanks for listening.